Hey guys, welcome back to day 3 of this Winter Wonderland series. Today we're going to be working on replicating this 3D tumbler that I did a couple of years ago. I loved the first one that I did, but I only created the sweater stripes every other space. So I figured this time around I would go for the entire 3D tumbler. And I wanted to show you guys a hack on how I do this 3D without having to use clay or a 3D mold or anything like that. You can quickly, easily, and very cheaply create this design. So I found this mold at Joann Fabrics, and this is actually a pie crust mold, and I want to say I got this for maybe like $8 or $10. It was on sale. And I just take some hot glue, and after measuring the size of the cup that I'm working with and marking it off, I'm just going to put the glue right into the pie crust mold there and let it sit and dry for probably about 2 to 3 minutes after they've been halfway filled, and then we can remove them and let them cool. Now I will tell you guys, the fuller that you fill the hot glue into these molds, the thicker the sweater veins, I want to say, will be. So I only fill them up about halfway, maybe a little bit less than halfway, to prevent a super bulky tumbler. Obviously that's personal preference. If you want something really bulky, you can fill it up all the way, but considering the amount of epoxy that you would have to put over this and the glitter as well, it's going to be pretty thick. So I usually go with about half. That seems to be good. And then we'll go ahead and start laying these down. I trimmed off any excess pokey bits that were on these glue stripes, and then I took my Cami Page Boutique cup cradle and I just used it to create a straight vertical line on the cup, just so we have a good straight starting point to lay down this first piece of sweater onto the cup. I will say that I would go around about every quarter of the way just to make sure that your stripes are staying completely straight, upright, and vertical, that you're not slightly angling them so they're not going to be off once you get back to that beginning seam. And then we're just going to take the bottom portion of the mold that we created. We want to make sure that the edge of the mold, of the pie crust mold at the bottom, is going to be what we're laying at the bottom of the cup. So we want all of those the little sweater pieces here to be completely flat on the bottom, and then we'll go around the top and trim that to size once we get them laid down. We're going to go around and continue laying these down with this super glue that I'm using on the stainless, and I would recommend just doing kind of a trial run when you get about halfway through, just to make sure that things are going to fit and line up completely seamless once you get back to the beginning seam of the tumbler. This worked out perfectly. Everything was pretty smushed together, but obviously that's going to have to be adjusted depending on the size and type of tumbler that you're using. You may need to space out your sweater pieces here just a little bit to make sure that there's a consistent space between them, or that you can just smush them all together. You can also do that by measuring the size of the hot glue mold here, or measuring your tumbler and then kind of doing the math and figuring out how many pieces that you're going to need, and how many it's going to take to go around, and whether or not they'll meet up seamlessly in the end. So once I get those hot glue pieces laid down, I'm going to take rubber bands and put them on the cup just to make sure that the super glue dries, that the pieces aren't going to lift. So I'm going to double up the rubber band on the top and bottom just to ensure the edges, or the top and the bottom pieces of the hot glue aren't going to lift. And then I just put 3 singular rubber bands in the middle just to make sure everything stays in place, and I let that sit overnight. You probably could just wait a couple of hours and it would be fine, because it is super glue. It doesn't take super long to dry. And then after I removed the rubber bands, I took my X-Acto knife and I put it in the tip of my heat gun just for a few seconds, just to heat it up so it kind of scores the glue. And if you're not great at doing this in a straight line, I would recommend you use some sort of like a tape measure or a piece of tape to make sure that the top rim is a consistent straight line when you're cutting off these excess glue pieces so it doesn't look real wobbly at the top. And then once we get that done, we're gonna move into our spray paint. After all the excess was scored off, I just went around the top rim with my heat gun, and please remember you're using hot glue and a heat gun, so obviously it's gonna melt if you hold it on there too long. I just barely put the heat gun on the top rim of the cup and just used my fingers to press it down to make sure everything was laid flat. There were some pokey pieces on the top, so I just wanted to make sure those got a little bit squishy and melted and pushed them down so they didn't cause any problems with the epoxy. So next we're gonna go in with ivory spray paint from Rust-Oleum, and we're gonna be pretty heavy-handed on this. So also these look like noodles. I can't unsee it. But I'm gonna go in with 3 different coats of paint. I did let it dry between each coat. I just hit it with my heat gun, ran back inside, came back out, and then sprayed it 3 separate times. You want to make sure that you're getting this spray paint in between the noodles and in the top rim and the bottom rim. And then once that's dry, we're going to use spray glue, not epoxy, to adhere this. This first round of glitter, I sprayed Loctite on the tumbler, and as you can see, it did not stick at all. I don't know if it was an old bottle, but I don't know if that's why it didn't stick. I haven't used Loctite in probably like 6 years. So I went back through with this 3M spray, and I made sure to get the crevices between the molds to ensure full coverage in the spaces between the mold. And then I used Chantilly from Peachy Olive Glitters to apply the glitter on the cup. And then I went back in after making sure that the bottom edges, top edges, the rim of the cup, all of the spaces in between were filled, and then I did a second coat of that 3M spray just to make sure we had super full coverage. You probably could just do 1 if you wanted to, if you were really great about filling any spaces. Just wanted to make sure we didn't miss anything. And then after that was dry, I let it sit overnight. I spray sealed it with Krylon Triple Thick Spray 4 separate times, very heavily. I attempted to go in with epoxy. I just did a little test spot without spraying it, and because we use that spray sealer instead of epoxy, it moved immediately. As soon as I applied that epoxy, just in one 1 inch space, it completely wiped the glitter off. So that is an absolute must do. You must seal this glitter. You're gonna completely lose all of the glitter if you're adhering it with that spray sealer. So make sure you're doing that and letting that dry. And then I'm gonna go in very heavy-handed with the Flynn Sisters Fast Setting Epoxy. I would recommend, after experiencing this, I would recommend using the regular setting epoxy for this first layer because it's so thick and because you have really deep crevices between these little sweater pieces. I did get a few more bubbles than I normally would. They're a little bit bigger than I normally would get them, like bigger than micro bubbles. So definitely would recommend using a regular setting epoxy first. We're gonna apply it very heavy-handed, and then we're gonna go back through and do some damage control once we've got all of the spaces filled in. I'm just gonna take my finger and run it between the crevices of these sweater pieces, and I'm gonna pull out any excess epoxy just to make sure it's not super muddled up in those empty crevices there. The thicker your epoxy, the less chance that you're gonna have for the microbubbles to escape. And that was part of my problem. Even though I did a lot of damage control, I did pull the epoxy out. My epoxy was already starting to kind of set up. It was getting a little bit warm, and I didn't go back multiple times and torch it like I should have. I just got distracted with other cups. So I would definitely recommend checking this about every 10-15 minutes or so, going back, torching it, or using your heat gun to make sure all of those air bubbles have a chance to escape. And then once this cured, I went through and I sanded it 2 times. I put 2 coats of epoxy on it, sanding between each time, just to make sure everything was as smooth as possible. Keep in mind this is 3D, so obviously it's not going to be as smooth as a normal tumbler would be. You can definitely feel some definition in the bumps of the sweater pieces. That is intentional. There's no way to fix that unless your cup is gonna turn into a weapon. So keep that in mind. I did 3 coats of epoxy, 1 fast set, 2 regulars, and after that was all done, curing this cup was completely finished. So let me know what you thought in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you're not already, hit that bell button for tomorrow's tutorial, and I will see you again soon.